It's time to look at the power of constraints, because without constraints, rigging would be nigh on impossible. In this lesson, I'll go over some of the common constraints that we'll use, but we'll practice them in some fun exercises later. Now, when it comes to constraints, you can actually have object constraints and also bone constraints. Well, that is if the object is an armature, of course. Now, the object constraints are located in this tab here, and if you're in pose mode with the armature selected, you'll see this tab here. Now, you won't see that tab if you're in any other mode, like edit mode, or you have an object that isn't an armature selected. It will only show when you have an armature in pose mode. There we go. Now, the differences between the object constraints and the bone constraints should be pretty obvious to you by now. The object constraints are on the object container level. You can see here in my list, add object constraints, we've got a whole list here. And we also have a very similar list with the bone constraints here. Now, a lot of them are the same, but you do have a few more to choose from when you are dealing with bones. Now, in this course, we'll be taking a look at most of these bone constraints. Now, you can see here from our list that they're actually broken up into 4 categories. We've got motion tracking, transform, tracking, and then relationship. So we'll be skipping all of the motion tracking ones, mainly because they've got to do with motion tracking data, and that's not the focus of this course. But we'll be looking at most of these other constraints here with a few exceptions. The transformation cache constraint actually uses an external cache file that holds a list of transformations over time, which is also outside the scope of this course. So I'll be skipping this one. And I'm also going to skip the pivot constraint because of this word in the tooltip, buggy. I have tried many times to create something useful out of this constraint, but I've found it to be way too buggy. So for that reason, I'm just going to pretend it doesn't exist. But we will look at all the others on the list. Okay, so before we dive into how these constraints work, let's go over some of the important terminology and some of the common settings that are shared among the different constraints. And then in the next videos, we can jump in and look at what the individual constraints actually do. Probably the most important thing you need to understand is the terms owner and target. Now, owner is the bone that the constraint is placed on. That is the owner of the constraint. And the target is where the information is coming from, the target of that constraint. They can get a little bit confusing, but as long as you understand that the owner is where the constraint is located, then you can figure it out from that. At least that's the way my mind works anyway. All right, so let's quickly have a look at how you add a constraint. I have my armature selected here and I'm in pose mode. Remember, that is the mode that you'll get your bone constraints to show up. And we make sure that we select the owner of the bone. Remember, that's always important. And then we also have the little menu here. So you can just choose whatever you want. I'm just going to choose copy location for now. We've got a red icon here, which means it's not set up correctly. Now here is a target. So we need to target the object first. So I'm going to click this and choose the armature object. And this is the same object that we're working within. And then once we've chosen that, we've got the little item here saying which bone inside that armature do you want to target? And we can just click in here and then choose the name of the bone, which I've already named target. So there we go. We've got the copy location constraint working. I'm going to show you now the fast way of setting this up using the keyboard shortcuts. The way that I think about it is this. First, we select the target and then we shift select the owner. So the owner is selected last. The way that I think about it in my mind is we select the target first going, hey, who wants a constraint? And then we select that guy and we go, I do. And that is the order that we select. Who wants a constraint? I do. And then we can use the keyboard shortcut, Control-Shift-C. And we've got our list of constraints here. So then we go copy location, and that has already set up these two things. So that is really, really fast. I'll just do that one more time. Select the target. Who wants a constraint? I do. Control-Shift-C, choose your constraint. Copy rotation. Now, many different constraints will have an option for you to choose what space you want it to be working in. That is for the target and the owner. Now, more often than not, you want these to both be in the same space. So either both in world or both in local space, but the situations can vary. Now, the influence on the constraint is how much the constraint is turned on or off. 0 is off and 1 means 100% on. Because sometimes you don't want a constraint to be 100%, you only want it to influence it a little bit. This is where you control that with the influence. Now, this is not to be confused with the eyeball up here, which will disable the constraint. It basically mutes it, turns it off. This is like a switch on or off. Now, this icon here will actually lower the influence down to 0, but it will then add the transforms to the local transforms of our bone. Let me just show you. You see up here it's 0, and then we click that, you'll see we've actually got our values in here. although our influence is still 0. This can come in handy in many situations. Now, I've already mentioned this a few times, that the order in which they're calculated is from the top to the bottom. So the order of the constraints matter. Now, some constraints won't affect the other ones in the stack, so it doesn't matter, but some do. You always need to think about the order logically, because sometimes you might find yourself overriding a constraint that you didn't mean to, and it won't work the way that you intend. But you can always reorder the stack by grabbing this little icon here and dragging it up or down. And this button here will delete individual constraints. However, there's also a way that we can remove all at once, and that's up here under our pose. You can see our constraints submenu here, and then we say clear pose constraints, which has the shortcut Control-Alt-C. So you can either choose it from the menu or Control-Alt-C, and that will delete all the constraints on the selected bones. Now, there's also a way that we can copy a constraint, or actually all the constraints, from one bone to other selected bones. And the way that we do that is we select all of the other bones first, and then we select the bone that we want to copy last. So with them active, up here in our pose menu, we've got constraints and we've got copy constraints to selected bones. Now with this option, it will actually copy all of the constraints, but it will erase any that already exist. So this bone here actually has a copy scale. I just want you to pay attention to when we copy this. So pose, constraints, copy constraints to selected bones. Then they're all got the same constraints, although this one, that copy scale has now been deleted. And if you're wondering why nothing happened, is I just had those muted. It's going to copy the settings as well. That can come in handy when you have lots of constraints to set up on many different bones. But just remember, it would always delete any constraints that are on those bones before it does that operation. That's most of the shared settings explained. Now let's jump in and have a look at each one of these constraints and what they actually do.